Welcome to Switch Your Sitch podcast with your host, Katie Turner. Very excited today. I've got Zara Kay here from Faithless Hijabi. I met Zara when I owned the Pod Hub, or co-founded with Liam. It was probably close to 2 years ago. I met you there. And what a journey it's been over the last 2 years. And we're going to get into that, how you have switched your sitch in terms of your religion, and wars have been built on that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about, just touch on how you were detained overseas because of your passion and your pursuit. And also how you are really passionate about this this honor-based abuse. And we'll deep dive into that a little bit more with our listeners. And also the contrast, and I was just talking to you about this off air, being brought up by a single mom, blonde hair, blue eyes in Australia, where the world really has been my oyster in terms of my outlook and what I'm able to do. I went to university. I'm heavily involved I was a personal trainer 20 years ago, and it was 1 in 5 PTs were female. I've also done a degree in economics, which, when I went to university 20 odd years ago, again, it was the minority, but it wasn't frowned upon or even shunned. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Zara. If you can give an insight into your background, your journey a little bit so far, and the organization that you have founded.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Thanks for having me. So I guess it's the past 6 months have been quite interesting and insightful, not just for me personally, but also in an overarching scenario on how, I guess, different communities react to changes that involve women empowerment. And for the longest time, how you said that you come from a different background where you were empowered. Similarly, not exactly the same, but relative to other people in Tanzania, I had the freedom. So my parents did pay for the education. They weren't very pushy about it. So I'm a middle child, and I was the first one to go to university, but now my younger sister is going and my baby sister is considering. So I broke a few barriers for them, and I am quite proud, but I cannot wait to see what my younger sisters turn out to be. And I've seen my family move from a bit more conservative, like they still wear hijab and they still believe spiritually more than they do politically in the religion. But I've seen them move to a more feminist stance. And it took a lot of, I was at the point of it where I was coping all the negativity, the comments about shame, honor, to a point that now it's not even a subject about you're making us look bad. It's more about, are you sure you want to go down this route? Because, it brings out a lot of negativity. It was like, as compared to a lot of my friends who did get married at 18, who I was also around. The school I went to was a Muslim school. It was an Islamic school. And everything was in English. We did our Cambridge exams, and, I applied for university when I was 14. I applied for college first, so a diploma. And nobody at that time was even thinking about it. And I was like, I can't be in Tanzania. It doesn't feel like me. So despite being around that environment where everybody was just like, oh yeah, maybe I'll do my A-levels and then maybe just stay in Tanzania and do this, or, maybe I'll get engaged. And I knew some of the girls knew their future was high school and you're getting married. That's it. And while I never had that certain future idea, I didn't know what was next for me, but I knew I needed to get out of Tanzania. I was always I was always rebellious. I was always quite nerdy, and I would come back home from school, even like nursery in grade 1, and I'd start reading. So I got an insight into more of a progressive culture through books, and it wasn't. I think the biggest, the culture shock wasn't as much as, going abroad and, finding out different things. The culture shock was coming back to Tanzania this time and seeing that 12 years later, it has still remained the same. Like 12 years later, I thought there would be more progressive people, there would be more changes, there would be more women running the show, there would be more women in just even in the community I came from, in the seats, and making decisions as well. And 12 years later, it's just remained the same. And I always felt like a misfit in Tanzania, but this time particularly, like, I know none of my friends were from the community, so it was easier for me to have a good time with my family and my expat friends. But it was just that every, like, not mixing things up, but every time we went out as a family, you could see that we were, I wouldn't say a positive spotlight, but it was quite, everybody would just look at us. So be from like the dresses I would wear, the photos I would take, and my partner, who is very English, was there, and very white, doesn't understand a word we're all talking about. And we were celebrating birthdays and taking photos, and it was so, you could see people just looking at us. I don't know if it was out of envy, out of gossip, but it was like the place had never changed, but I saw my family had changed, and they learned the six. Yeah, and I think my perspective with all of it had become a more compassionate one, to build bridges versus find differences. So
There's just the notion that it should be you and us, them and us, rather than and you and I, you and us. And I think that's one barrier that exists in society. It's always got to be one or the other, as opposed to the inclusive of and.
yeah.
So how old were you when you decided to take your headdress off? And was it because of the oppression, or was it some other reason?
So, I started wearing it when I was 8, turning 9 just a few months before, and I wanted to wear it because, I knew my future was that as a Muslim girl, or a woman that I'm going to become, I'm going to have to wear it. There is no other option, right? That was the surrounding, that was the community, that was the environment, that were my friends, who some of them had started wearing, some of them were older than me, like a year in school, and they'd all started wearing. So I was like, you know what, I want to wear, I want to be more religious. I know this is coming, so I might as well get used to it. And then at 12, when I started seeing more colorful hijabs coming about, or different dresses, and different people from different families would dress less conservative in black. So I used to wear all black, and and then watching movies, and reading books, and I still do, but I had really silky long black hair, and I loved it. Like, I used to comb it like so many times at home, and going out, I'm like, all right, so it's all in a bun, tying it up. But I remember distinctively, and my mom doesn't remember this, and I reminded her, and she doesn't remember this at all. But I remember going up to her, and I was 12, and I was like, what if I want to remove it? Like, what if there's some days that I don't want to wear it? Even though I knew that I'll be punished in hell, but at that day I was like, I'm under my parents' roof. I need to ask them about this decision. Or like, any child, any about to become teenager would have to ask their parents about any big life decisions. And she's like, I don't think your dad is going to agree to that. She never said no, but she's like, your dad's not going to agree to that. And I'm like, but then what? And then she's like, it really depends when you get married and what your husband's going to say. And I accepted that answer with, I accepted it because that was it. But then I remembered that there's something wrong with that system. There's something wrong where I did not have my autonomy. I didn't think much of it then when I was 12. But the biggest, by far, culture shock was when I was 16. I left home. I was still wearing the hijab, and I was in Malaysia, a Muslim majority country. And I went to a prayer room. I was on and off with prayers. It wasn't a big part of my life, but because I was with my family, and I think my friends went to pray, so I was like, okay, well, so I don't get embarrassed, I'm going to go and pray. And I go to a prayer room, and I see this woman, non-hijabi, entering the room. There were some dresses. She wears those dresses, like a covering herself. She prays, she removes it, and then she leaves. And I'm like, that's a Muslim woman who does not wear the hijab. It was something so small became such a big pivotal moment for me, where I was like, that's you can do that. You can actually do that.
Possible.
Yeah, and I was so surprised. And there were times between that period to when I actually moved it, just before I turned 19, so I was 18. But when I was 17 and in university, I went for salsa classes wearing a hijab, a dress, stockings, long sleeves. And I was like, I know it's haram, but I love music and I really want to know how to dance, because I came from such a techie background that I was always around boys and they said I could never dance. So I'm like, to prove you wrong. So I went for salsa classes and it just got in the way. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to put you out there, like 20 people in the room. And my lecturer was there and he was a bit like, you're not wearing the hijab, and he didn't really make a big fuss out of it, but it was something new for him as well to see me take it off and then put it back on when I leave. But I was so excited about doing it and, just turning and twirling with my hair, my hair flowing. And slowly I used to wear an abaya as well, so a black veil on and off. There were times and periods in my life that when I went to Iran, Iraq, in Syria, like for pilgrimage, you come back a bit religious and then it wears off after time. So I came back wearing it again. And then after a while, I was just like, it's not me. The dresses I buy, they're body fitting. I like it. And even if I wear long sleeves, sometimes it takes the look out of it, like I'd wear an inner, but I don't want to cover my hair. So I slowly loosened it up. I remember 18. And now I wasn't drinking alcohol until I was like very recently, 3-4 years ago, I started. So, I'd still wanted to go to a club because I loved music. Like I was deprived of music. And now I'm like, I have headphones and, music and school. And there are always this cultural shots. I went to a club and that's when before the club, I had my hijab on. At the moment I was in the line, I'd take it off and like put it around my neck. And I think for the first time, it just felt like it was me on the dance floor. And it slowly then, started becoming a thing where I'd wear it halfway and everyone's like, oh, you're not really wearing it. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Like, it doesn't really matter. So that's how I slowly progressed to remove it. But, until 2015, because I was still financially dependent on my parents with my tuition fee, I didn't want to step on their toes. So I told them I had removed it in Malaysia. In Malaysia, like by the end of it, and I was moving to Australia then. And that I felt more comfortable that by the time I moved to Australia to completely remove it, because new life, people don't know me, I'm not being held to a certain standard. So it was like a fresh start for me, but it still felt very naked. Just a small thing.
Covered up for how many years was that? 10 odd years.
Yeah. And it's like, it's not like you wear it at home. And, we've gone to the beach and my parents have been quite relaxed about it. Sometimes we've tried wearing it in pools, but they've never really been so strict. And sometimes it was my brother enforcing it, and now he doesn't do that. Like, they've seen me in a bikini and, I've taken photos and, but they don't do this now. But like it was never that heavily enforced with my family when it came to pools and stuff. But it was certainly that, normally where I'm going to university, taking a train, like a daily life, it just felt so naked. And I was like, I was a lot skinnier than I am, but I just felt like there were so many aspects of my body I did not like.
Yeah, right. I've been covered up for so long.
Yeah. And I was never taught to love my body. You're never taught what body positivity is. You never, like, things like just buying the right bra size, your mom has never talked to you about it, sex ed, just so many things. And this comes into the larger picture of honor, abuse, violence, but also a lot of these things that are quite shameful to talk about, because I think the idea is the more we normalize these talks, the more we're accepting of our daughters or the women in our family to, I guess, go out there and have sex. I think sex ed is a very important part of any young girls growing, but our parents never did that, because that means they're approving of you going to have sex. And that's obviously, that will, bring shame to the family. So usually you have it at the night of your wedding, but at the night before your wedding.
So let's touch on this honor-based abuse, and the rise of your foundation, Faithless Hijabi, is it so that women do feel like, firstly, that they can take that off yet still uphold their own values? Is it that you want to push that it is possible to be able to do anything, whether you're male or female? And is it based around this, what has been oppressed in our lives of talking about sex, talking about things that are natural in a whole community?
Yeah, I mean, truth be told, when I first came out as an ex-Muslim, I didn't know that term existed. I was never planning to be an activist because I was always for women empowerment, but I do engineering panels and I do analytics panels and I'd be a mentor in analytics. But then, religion wasn't an integral part of my life when I started working. So around, let's say 2014 to 2017, it was there, kind of there, praying, fasting sometimes. No, yes, I was alone. There was nobody forcing me. There was nobody trying to force that idea on me. So faithless hijabi grew out of me expressing my views, getting so much backlash. And this is just me saying purely things like, I feel free without the hijab, or, I've removed it since 2012 or 2011. And I was called names by my own friends. People who didn't even know me would come on my wall, and I wasn't like an activist or anything then. They're like, oh, you're just there to please white people, you're a slut, you're a whore. And it was horrible receiving that, because I'm like, I'm just living my life. Why does it bother you that I'm not wearing it? But off the back of it, Muslim women and ex-Muslim women would message me. Some people very confused about their religious perspective would message me and talk about horrendous things that have happened. So relatively, it made my journey so much easier. Like, it looked so much easier as compared to these girls who have been raped by family members, brothers, fathers, like these girls who have uncles have touched them inappropriately, and they have never recognized that as a child.
Because they can't say anything. That will bring pain to the family, or they don't know, right?
They don't know. They don't know any of this. For the longest time, I remember my mom saying I cannot wear shorts or sleeveless in front of my dad. And it was always meant to make me feel ashamed of my body. But on the back of it, if you think about it, you're like, what are you trying to say? And now my family have now understood, because I went like, when you say these things, this is the idea you're trying to implement, right? And she's been a bit more careful, and sometimes it goes up and down because she's had that all her life, right? And ironically, my mom started wearing a hijab when she was 23, after she married my dad, right? So 23 is a really late age for her to get married. And this is like in her time in the 1980s, right? So this is
back then.
Yeah, and it was. I think religion became more of a thing a little later on, especially with media and media coverage. And 9/11 was a very turning point for a lot of Muslims and converted to Islam, because they were like, why are Muslims being demonized, versus let's learn more about the religion before we convert. But yeah, so the idea, that people were going through so much more than what I was, it was impossible to stay silent. So when we came up with this name, I had a friend who's still part of the organization, but not public anyway. We were thinking about promoting it more in Sydney, where people like me, who had never thought about questioning their religion or their body autonomy or agency, have that power to do it. And we were going to go for promotional ads, just talking about, I have been abused, stop forced marriage, stop this. And it did quite turn out to be like, because Facebook always doesn't allow such controversial opinions, but I hope that changes, because I think it's now there's a reaction to how social media is being taken now. But at the time, that was the idea that, when we came up with the name, it was like doubting hijabi. It was like, oh, is she really faithless? Like, what was our aim? Because it was in between. But then we were like, faithless hijabi, the name, it was so powerful that, why would you be faithless in a hijabi, right? One, it's not a choice, you're forced, but also, what can you be faithless in a hijabi, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
it just shakes up that whole identity crisis, doesn't it? Like, you can still believe and not wear, or you don't have to believe and wear. It's sort of like, hang on a minute, you're just causing confusion to the whole platform here.
Exactly. So people are like, what does faithless hijabi do? And we started off as just a storytelling platform. All we did was Instagram stories about women. To a point, a year later, those stories, all of them were so similar that we're like, what are the actionable items we're doing from here? Yes, we're advocating through stories, and that's great. We're giving people a voice. But we had some comments from women. They're like, this is my story. And you put it out there, and obviously they don't want to say their story anymore because this is already exactly their story. Somehow my story resonated with parts of it resonated with so many women, and some of it were just, the hardest parts about being abused, assaulted, and whatnot resonated with other women. But then, storytelling is one side of it, which is powerful. What else are we doing? Where is that safe space where people can talk? But then, so we wanted to open a group for discussion, and we're like, but how are we going to fit who's being abusive, who's a Muslim, trying to abuse other? And it becomes so much harder when it comes to safeguarding rules.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is the one thing that we're going to touch on anyway, was like, do you think globalization and having, tech platforms for this, it actually brings rise to the cause, or does it bring more demonization to change? It's sort of that to and fro, isn't it? Like,
yeah, it goes both ways. I think largely it has been quite helpful to many women to identify other women like them, even things like I said, we were never taught about sex education, and then or drinking, or how to drink, and now you have women who are out in the free world, and they can be abused because they were never normalized into the drinking culture, and just as little things. And just as little things are being used by a lot of Muslims to say, you see, this is why alcohol is bad. And I'm like, no, the truth is that these women never got their freedom. They never got their guidance to be independent women.
That's right.
And now they've gone out there and are,
it's seeing the free world and everything it has to
getting
offer.
all that freedom at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's that point across any society, is that, if you're given the correct information and the right education, whether it be alcohol, whether it be sex education, it actually benefits as opposed to oppression, where you're told not to touch it, it's bad, it's terrible, it's against religion, or whatever those values are.
Yeah, and exactly. And this is where there are so many spaces for atheist organizations. And this is not unique with ex-Muslims. This happens with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-evangelicals, and, societies that have been quite isolated. And try keeping everybody inside that bubble to a point that, I've had girls who have never used a bus card to go on the bus alone. And I have spoken to other people from different faiths who've left, and they're like, yeah, we had that too. And this gives rise to a lot of different people to come up with different organizations, different speech, different form of guidance. So we had things like Faithless Hijabi then started a podcast. So we're like, how do we get people to talk about their trauma when they're happy to be public, but also have other people enjoy listening to a story they've never heard versus a written form. So we started with Life After Islam, and then we had Support Corner, where we're like, we're going to give it to 20 to 30 minutes where we talk about what happens, why do you think of hell, how do you grieve, what are our examples, in a contrasting, because this girl came from Saudi, I came from, and we're both in the West, but we've both had similar and very different backgrounds, because I had a bit more freedom and she didn't. So how did we come out of it, and how can we use this to help others? So we started making videos, and And then, after a few months of, COVID was a great time for people to make content.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And after that, we started our mental health program where I found a clinic that, had spots and they weren't very expensive, and they went into collaboration. And I'm like, I'll get you the people, I'll find the funding, I'll raise money. And it was actually a university friend of mine who saw one of my posts about this young girl committed suicide and sent me £500. And he's like, I don't know how to help, but you're helping. I know this money will go into good cause. And I'm like, you gave me a brilliant idea. This can help with therapy.
A common thought process these people go through when they are banished from a community or from a family. They don't have any support networks. They may be in a different country. I mean, I'm sure that's, feeling so isolated. My family are in Brisbane, which is only, an hour's flight away. And sometimes I feel quite isolated. So I can't imagine not having any of those support mechanisms.
Or being in your family and not being yourself, leading a double life, which is even worse. I mean, I had a call with a friend yesterday, and I was talking about all the good and the bad in my family, and she's like, I could never imagine the good that you're saying with my family because they've been so abusive to me. And we're like, how do you get over such trauma? Or how are and we have girls in the Middle East who are not allowed to go outside and study, work. So, helping them slowly go, like, if you're looking at IT courses, there's so many online. And, if people want to volunteer, and we're always looking for some talent. We're always looking for people to help us, especially if they have any kind of skill and they're willing to help support other women. But a lot of times, even with the mental health program, they can't talk over the phone. They can't have discussions, or they can't have therapy over the phone. And that also creates a safeguarding issue where the therapist is like, I don't feel safe texting them because they're in trouble. And I'm like, sometimes that's their only lifeline. And we need to go through voice notes and text and, accommodate to what we do have versus not do anything.
Is it just women? I mean, is there oppression in men with that basis of not wanting to be part of the religion, or who want to break that mold?
In a smaller scale, but usually it's I think they're more victims of honor-based abuse that are women. But with men, I think they can receive a lot of violence because they're men, but not from their families only, outside communities and mobs. So if you look at a lot of these killings that are not classified as honor killings, these happened from mobs who would have killed a blog writer and people who've drawn blasphemous art, or who've even just expressed dissent, not even being an ex-Muslim or anything. Have gone like, I think women should get equal rights. And it does happen with men. We do have men in the program because it made no sense limiting it. And we also opened up a few spots for women who are still Muslim and men who are still Muslim, who want to get that help. And it doesn't have to do anything with religion, but mental health support. Because our communities, and myself, like my mom would tell me, why don't you pray? Why don't you do this? And only now when I talk to her, and she's like, if the doctor has recommended that you should go for therapy, then you should go for therapy. And I'm like, thanks, mom. And she's like, I'll pray for you. And I'm like, I appreciate that. I absolutely appreciate that. That.
I'm not asking you to change what your belief system are, but let me follow mine.
Yeah, exactly. And it took me, I don't know if the sound is different because my headphones just died.
No, it's fine.
Okay, perfect. And it still took me a while to accept that, hey, these are people who are different, who think differently than I do. And these ideological differences sometimes can be quite traumatizing. I remember when I initially had panic attacks, and my mom was like, pray this, do this. And I'm like, Mom, I don't believe in prayers. Even if I put the thing on just to make you happy, it doesn't help me. It only gives me more trauma. And now, going to Tanzania, I've created this culture where we're so
mental health positive, where, you know, my sister goes for therapy, my brother went for therapy, trying to get my parents to go for therapy, and that might not happen, but slowly help them understand that these are boundaries. And that's also something we teach the girls. You know, when people go like, how do I tell my mom about this? Or I wanted to remove the hijab and she just slapped me. Or so helping them create conversation, or, you know, writing down about boundaries, like what are boundaries? How do you enforce them? And what do you do when there's violence in return for boundaries? You're kind of, do you completely step away from it? Or do you start establishing a different relationship where you don't have to go all the way and go like, I don't want to do this. I'll go like, can you please knock the next time you're in my room? Only because I might not be wearing any pants, or, you know, I might be, you know, indecently dressed, and kind of playing with what we have to garner support for these women and helping them navigate what be violent behavior. And this happens a lot with, you know, you'll see, I did a lot of research on domestic abuse and honor-based abuse, just to see what are the differences.
What are they? Because I was thinking the same thing when I was researching it. I was like, this is just sounds like domestic violence without perhaps always that they're hitting.
Yeah, exactly. Well, honor-based violence is part of domestic violence. The only difference is the intent of it comes from a specific set of morals that are obviously subjective, that are set by the family. And it is more prevalent in Muslim communities, but not limited to, because there are a lot of Hindu communities that are very conservative. There are a lot of Jewish communities, like ultra-Orthodox Jews, that also have it, but at a lower scale. But I think just being like practicing Islam at its base, like just the notion of hijab, I think it taps into a lot of different issues, you know, before going into the whole argument of how it's misogynistic, but it's all about preserving honor in the family. And this is why the woman should wear a hijab, or this is why she should sit like this and not like that. Or not talking to men, because, you know, then there are rumors that go around, and, you know, there have been, you'll see a lot of cases of honor killings, and until it gets to that point that she had a boyfriend, or you know, in Egypt, I think it was somewhere, Egypt or Iran, a guy proposed to the girl and they were both jailed. And that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. But the idea is all about honor, preserving that culture, stopping any form, not even progression, but stopping any form of freedom. And it lies mostly on the shoulders of women, because there's less honor based on men, because, like, you know, things like virginity are held so sacred in Muslim families that, you know, men can go sleep around. But, you know, when it comes to women, hymen testing, they're all parts of honor abuse. Even more so that we don't recognize all of this as honor abuse until somebody is hit or somebody has been killed, and it only comes at honor killing. You know, we've always heard of honor killing more than we've heard of honor abuse. And I would tell my dad, and, you know, when I told my dad this time especially, I wore a dress that was knee length, and he was just staring at me, and I lifted it up and I'm like, it's only legs, it's only flash, it doesn't represent who I am, it doesn't say anything about who I am. It's only because I like wearing it. I feel, you know, empowered or whatever. It's just clothes. You know, just the way you wear a green t-shirt and I never tell you anything about it, it's just clothes. We need to disassociate that idea that I am shameful for certain dressing styles. And, you know, just even, I remember my mom, you know, when I was like, kind of like, I'd still wear a hijab when I'd go to Tanzania, even though I'd officially removed it, but they're like, you know, they're like, just wear something halfway, you know, so people don't talk. And at home, we would never wear it. So if somebody, like when we had maids and chefs at home who were male, and that it's quite common, not saying that, you know, we're quite rich, it's quite common in East Africa to have that, or drivers. And I would never wear that in front of them, and they never had a problem with it, and they wouldn't either. it was mostly to do with the community and what they would respond. So that's why I would wear it after I'd removed it, until one day when I went home and I was like, you don't pay for my rent, you don't pay for my education, but thank you for everything. But this is me taking my power back, right?
And
I
that's such
respect.
an empowering feeling, isn't it? I mean, these are deeply, deeply ingrained views that have been generational. And I think travel, education, globalization have started to shake that up. And, you know, why do we have to be oppressed? Why aren't we allowed the opportunities? Why is it our fault if we are abused, or we don't even know that we're being abused? It's not talked about, it's thrown under the carpet.
Yeah. Interesting enough, when I was doing my research about honor-based abuse, they highlighted this narrative that I'd never thought of before, where women are perpetrators and victims, and secondhand victims of abuse when there is a primary victim. So, for instance, when it comes to abortion, right, it will be the mother who will most likely get the girl to abort the baby, or hit her to kill them, and further on, or get make sure she gets a miscarriage, than the father, especially when it comes to that scenario, only because the baby has been involved. But what also happens is sometimes where the mothers or sisters are blamed for the actions of that individual as committing crimes of crimes
so
of
that's another interesting point, that there is secondary victims,
yeah.
being the female as well, trying to protect that honor and committing a crime, and then doubly whammed for that. I mean, as a mother, I can't imagine ever, like, that your child is, for me, like, that's number one. It's the whole reason for living. And thankfully we're quite sheltered here in Australia, really.
To a certain degree. I mean, I feel like, you know, while I wasn't raised here, and I personally have always envied my parents for not going to the West when they did have the opportunity to go, because there's so many opportunities. Like, you know, they would be open to me learning a music instrument. My baby sister started learning drums for a bit, because we wanted to motivate her. Not like she'd still wear the hijab, and, you know, it's very edgy. But, you know, I always envied people in general who grew up in the West, because I never had, like in Tanzania, I never had opportunities of learning a different language. You know, it was always Swahili, English, and Arabic, but it was like I wanted to learn French, I wanted to do something different, and I lived vicariously through books and through other people. So even when I came overseas and I started learning how to dance, it was just me trying to do everything I could so that I'm living my life truly, you know, on the edge, but also like in my own terms. And yeah, it is like, it happens in Australia as well, that, you know, there are families that still practice these things that are not illegal in a way. So getting somebody married after the age of 18 isn't illegal. But how do we identify whether it's forced? Do you actually think that if you give a young girl who's 16 a choice where, you know, you're going to be forcefully married, but in the meantime, your parents are going to take care of you, your husband's going to take care of you, you know, we've already set it out for you. Or you could be on your own. You could be emancipated. You might be homeless. You don't know if you're going to get a degree. You have HECS to pay. You know, this is this. They don't have that support. What do you think that girl will choose when she's brought up her entire life being sheltered in a very different way? And, you know, and you've created, I think a lot of Eastern families, or a lot of family values that we have, are very tight knit, right? So like if I had my family in Australia, it would not be a question that I get to live away from home. I'd still be living with them unless I was married. Obviously that has changed now.
So it's still happening behind closed doors, is what you're saying. We're not aware of it because they are family structures.
Hymen checks are not illegal. Hymen checks are not illegal in Australia. They're not considered malpractice. Nobody.
So you can take your daughter to a doctor and have a hymen check, and it's not illegal. Wow.
Or, and I can't say it on certain because it was just yesterday when I was doing that research, but there are hymen reconstruction surgeries, which I can understand why they exist for different reasons, but I still think that they would have very valuable information to identify whether this woman is being abused, or a girl or a young girl is being abused. And that age, she could be a 27-year-old, right? But she's still quite sheltered in her family, wants to know whether she's had sex. And you know what's going to be likely is if she has her hymen broken, they're going to pay for her hymen construction surgery. But on the background, she's getting all that abuse. You know, her dignity is actually been stripped away from her the moment somebody asks her that. They're my parents had never asked what happened. Or, you know, I had a boyfriend home and we had our own room. And I saw that change. But, you know, I think my mom once asked me when I was 19, she's like, did you sleep with him? And I'm like, no, like I lost my virginity quite late. But it wasn't the religious part only. It was also a lot of like, it was ingrained in me to not bring shame to my family. And I wanted to do it with the right person. I wanted to be in the right frame of mind. Mm-hmm. And at that time, while I was dating and had boyfriends, career was so important to me. It was just like, I don't want to go through all of this so that, you know, there's so many backlash. I don't want to go through having sex and like, you know, my parents finding out, to then going like, oh, you've done something wrong. I didn't want to risk it. I always played it safe. So when I finally did remove the hijab or establish my own values, it had to be after I was financially independent. Which, if you think about it, in Australia, a lot of people have the opportunity to do it. But also there are parents who go like, oh, well, you know, you earn, it's our money, and that does happen. Or you're not allowed to work, you're just going to get married after you turn 18. Or how are psychologists and schools handling it? Because while high school may be mandatory here for all kids, I think you would know better about this, is homeschooling, technically you're allowed to homeschool, and some girls do go homeschooling because some girls are required to go because they're not allowed to mix with men.
Yeah.
So, all these laws, they're always
find loopholes to ensure. Yeah, they're finding loopholes to ensure that those values are upheld against society's views, really, isn't it? Because you know, that homeschooling to stop people going out. I mean, I love that you're educated, highly educated with a master's degree. You have traveled, you read, and I was brought up by a librarian. My mum's a librarian, and I love reading because it means that you can live your life in two places at once. It's a big part of the ocean. And there's a lot of movements out there, and there's a lot of, you know, people bucking the system, and there's a whole big environmental push at the moment. But what you're doing is not just bringing awareness to it, you're bringing the resources that these people need to be able to make a change as well. Because there's no use saying, hey, if you don't want to be Islamic, leave. You know, if you don't like the oppression.
It's such a difficult process. It's never like, there were so many times I've gone like, you know, maybe I'm a Muslim, and I've had people who've gone like ex-Muslim, Muslim, and ex-Muslim, Muslim, and you know, it's so confusing. It's so difficult because, and it's even more so when you leave at home, or there are some people have gone through all of that, but in a very not as extreme stages, and they've decided this is not for me, right? So it's so different out there for different people, but it was a difficult choice. And then the bigger choice is that now that I've decided to leave, and when you try digging deeper into why you left, I think for me specifically, it was so hard to stay silent. Like, how can I stay silent when there are people like, you know, Lujane, who was, you know, arrested in Saudi Arabia for women's rights. And then we have a lot of women in Saudi Arabia who in their 20s, early 20s, 23-year-olds who went like, I don't want to wear the hijab, have a 20-year sentence.
Wow.
Because they did that. And that's her whole life. And it definitely feels like I have been given that privilege, and it's not fair that I stay silent about it. And it comes at a lot of backlash, but it is, you know, I after my arrest that happened, because of my views, you know, because the community that I came from, that I initially had never thought how radical they were or how abusive they can be until this trip. Because had I known how crazy they would get, I would have never gone to Tanzania.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I'm Tanzanian, I have an Australian passport, and I went to see my family, and it was on like, you know, it was like 2 days. My brother's like, you know, I'm getting divorced, I need you here. And I'm like, all right, I'm booking my flight and we're coming. like in 2-3 days, flight ready. Like, it was not even a question of thought. But had I known it wasn't safe, I would have at least stayed in a different country, but close by. But
Did
it was
make you question your pursuit, your passion, your journey, like being detained in Tanzanian prison? I'm sure is not the best experience and none anybody wants to go through. So
I think if anything, it brought out a lot of, my brother every day still tells me, you're not weak, you are strong, and never let anybody say that to you. Never let anybody put that out, even if times when you see that, like, my life changed radically from, from November on my 28th birthday, where I was at the peak of my happiness, where I was like, my boyfriend's here, my family's here, we're going out, I can drink, like, not near my parents, but like when me and my brother go out, I will drink, I'll have a cocktail, and he'll have water or like soda, and we're just getting along, and I can wear what I want to, and I can go out with my friends in Tanzania who do drink. And I was just like, I am not ashamed of who I am. I'm so happy. And then and I had the best job that I wanted. It was the perfect job for me. I was so happy. I was like, I could work from home, and I was like, I'm going to go back in end of December. So I was actually going to fly on the 24th and the 25th when my brother was summoned at the police station. I'm like, okay, well, I was going to buy a last minute ticket because it was COVID. Nobody's going to buy last minute tickets. And I was like, they all look affordable. So if I ever wanted to go back, I just have to buy a ticket. And COVID tests weren't required at the time. So you could just go immediately in December to the UK. So I was like, well, I'll do last minute. And then my brother is served with this, police notice. And I'm like, oh, well, now I can't leave. I'll see what this is. It'll probably be over in a week. And he was called in because of me. So he's like, who is Zara Kay? So these police officers did not know. So Zara Kay is obviously not my legal name. It's not on my passport, but it is what I used online because it was simpler, it's easier, and it was definitely there to keep my family safe and a lot of different reasons. And, my brother is, at his first, like, he's just really says, like, my sister. And then I call her in, this isn't about you, this is about her. That was already illegal. They had no right to do this. They didn't even, I get in and they're like, where's your Tanzanian passport? And I'm like, no, Tanzanian ID card, like your national ID card. And I'm like, excuse me? And they're like, your national ID card, your Tanzanian national ID card. And I'm like, I'm not a Tanzanian national. I don't even live here. I'm here on holiday. I'm Australian. And they're like, but your brother sent me. And I'm like, and they're like, when you're lying, and they tried to point that, and then before I left, and I'm like, I told my brother, and I'm like, first contact my manager that I won't be working this week too, because just I didn't even know if I was going to get arrested or anything, because when they showed me the post, this was a post I wrote in May when I was in London, not even in Tanzania, and it was a satire post saying, oh my God, this is such a dumb arrest. Who gets arrested on that? It's not like North Korea.
That's right.
Like, I'm pretty sure even Saudi Arabia, people who've gone out of MBA, like, he's not going to, start arresting people and going like, oh, you're stupid. Right? That's such
like an amplified honor-based abuse, right? It's done on a national level.
Well, actually, what happened was it wasn't related. So my arrest, when the charges that they had were not related to my activism, but the people who had planned it and set me up were people from my community, like leaders of the community. So they're like, what can we get her on? The idiots did not bother looking up or Googling whether I was, like, if you Google it, it says Australian national. They never did that. They never did their research. They didn't know what my legal name was. I think they thought because I was there for 3-4 months and I was talking on my own platform about religion and whatnot, and I'd only 3 days before, a week before my arrest, I posted a photo of 2 men kissing in front of the Kaaba. It was a photoshopped image. But, people are getting angry. And I'm like, why? Why does it bother you? It's just a photo. You don't like it? Look,
That's right.
That's right. You don't like it? I don't like things. I don't like seeing little girls in hijab. I'm not going to go like attacking their parents. I'm just going to say, this breaks my heart because, my nieces have been there. My nieces have worn hijab and therefore when they'll just go to the mosque, and it's like, it's now turned into more, my money does it, so I'm going to do it. And, it's not seen as such a patriarchal flaw in that essence, but it is. But it was, parents would just make their kids wear it because they look cute, and then they do look cute unless you think about what it stands for and represents. So when I was arrested, I tweeted up, I'm like, when my brother calls me, he's a loudspeaker, and he's like, Zara, he never uses that name for me. And he's like, Zara, this is about your post. You need to come in. The first thing that hits my head is, what post have I possibly written that breaks Tanzanian law? Somebody could have just gone like, oh, she posted this, I didn't like it, and it offends me. And we would probably go like, okay, well, what's the fine? We'll pay the fine, whatever it is, right? I didn't think about it. And I was like, obviously this is a blasphemy post. What else have I posted? What else goes against the government? So I'm like, oh, fine, because of a blasphemy tweet. So before I knew it, I didn't have my phone for 2 days, or I didn't have any devices for 2 days. And when I went in and they were like, where's your Australian passport? And I'm like, obviously this wasn't about me. How would I have my Australian passport? It's at home, and I'm not at home. And I have a copy of it. And then I tell my brother in English, because I opted to speak in English. My Swahili isn't that great, but I do understand. And I told my brother, I'm like, you need to call the consulate. And they freaked out. They're like, oh, we'll tell them, we'll let them know. And I'm like, no, I told my brother, you need to call them and let them know. Here's their email. Here's what I've sent them before. And they know about it, because I told them I was getting threats about being anti-government. And the best thing the Australian government told me is like, why didn't you go to the police and tell them about this threat? And I'm like, oh, you want me to go to the police and tell them, oh, I'm being planted for anti-government? Why don't you just handcuff me right now? And I was just like, wow, that's not a solution. Like, what happens if this actually happens? And it did, right? So I look at that post. It was in May. I'm not a Tanzanian citizen. There's something known as free speech. I did not break any law when it came to that post. And then as I was there, they're like, oh, when did you surrender your Tanzanian passport? And I'm like, I never used it. I never surrendered it. I don't even know where it is, because I've been using my Australian passport the moment I got it. Like, why would I use a Tanzanian passport? I'm an Australian citizen. I was in Australia, moved to the UK with my Australian passport. And maybe it's somewhere in the UK. Maybe it's lost somewhere while I was moving. And, all of that then ended up scaring the police when I said call my consulate. So the police was like, oh, we'll let your president know as well. And I'm like, you were smart. You know that Australia doesn't have a president. like it's a prime minister, and he just shut up. And they thought I was rude because, when they were yelling at me, and when you have a disagreement, right? Or when I ask you a question and you start yelling, there's something wrong. It's not about that question at all, right? So the person yelled at me for asking, what number do you want? My UK number or my Tanzanian number? And he just aggressively yells and hits the table. He's like, I am trying to ask you a question. And I'm like, don't talk to me like that. Like, I was just like, don't talk to me like that. We're talking with respect. And had it not been for my brother, I would have been stern. And I'm not saying I'm badass, but at that point, I was not scared. I was just like, you guys have massively fucked up. I may go to jail, I may lose a lot of money, but you have massively fucked up, mostly because you had no idea who I was. Like, not just being an activist, but mostly because I'm an Australian national. At that point, I was so up behind my horses, thinking that Australia will come to my rescue. Australian consulates are going to go like, you know what? You had no right to arrest her. What are her charges? And, we had a lawyer, and we were like, okay, cool. We were prepared. But I was so wrong. I was so wrong. It was disappointing. Had it not been for the Australian government, I would have had my entire life back. So when I was saying 6 months ago, in November, when I had everything in order, and now I look at it and I'm like, it changed so drastically that honestly, Tanzanian government may have arrested me, but it was the Australian government who neglected the basic right of me getting a passport. I was stateless in a manner for 3 weeks where I didn't have a passport, and they wouldn't give me one. And I've already given them all the documents they need, including a lost report from the police station I got it from.
Because of politics? Because they don't want to get involved? What was the underlying?
Their reason was, how do we know your charges were dropped? And I was like, did they? So I'm like, who told you about my charges? I went to the media. My friends went to the media. Did you get an official letter from the government asking you or telling you that we've, arrested one of your citizens? Did they tell you this? And they're like, no, you just said you paid a lot for legal fees. And I'm like, yes, my lawyer, because I'm an international and because you didn't do anything. Had you come in, immediately called the police station and asked them, what has she done? What are the charges? What are we looking at? Had you even just made that one phone call, it would have broken down that day itself. But they arrested me intentionally during the Christmas break because there weren't a lot of officials working. So the case went higher up, and in that weekend where I'd already written about the blasphemy tweets, the news had picked up. People had started talking to the news, and they massively fucked up because when I went back to the police station, they didn't have my passport. They lost it, and they wouldn't tell me that. And my lawyer lied to me. He didn't tell me that. 4 days later is when he told me that. And I'm like, this is exactly something you should have told the Australian consulate about. Like, it was your duty to tell them that your government document has been lost. We don't have evidence of it, but you should know this for now. And
I mean, what a fear-based situation to be stuck with no passport, no papers, not knowing your future. I mean, I talk about fear to my business clients, which is, like a minuscule amount of fear compared to what you've just been through.
Going to the jail, being sexually assaulted, harassed, all of that was nothing as compared to that fear I felt when they denied me a passport, because I'm like, I could have left this. I could have gotten my life back. My UK visa, I could still go to the UK even if I had 1 day left on my visa, and gone like, this is a safer place for me to be in, because Australia takes months to get travel, but I am still a UK resident. And, they denied me a passport during that time that I had 3 weeks left on my visa, and I could have probably extended it on a compassionate reason. And in fact, the UK government, after I came to Australia, went on quarantine, gave me an exemption to go back. The UK government did more for me, and I told them exactly about my arrest, and their concern was, you don't have your passport back, but when you get it, just let us know 3 weeks in advance, and we will make sure that, you don't have to come in on a visa, but then you'd have to change your visa. You'll have limited travel until you can change your visa. But I'd already been here, and it was a good place to be during COVID. However, at that point I'd already lost my job, so why would I want to go back? Right? It's really hard, and I'm like, I'm already in Australia, so maybe just stay here for a few months, and see how I go. And if the UK government came through knowing all, the reasons for my arrest, seeing how ridiculous that was, right? And the Australian government did, and to date, there has been no accountability on their side. Every media news that has gone out and every journalist that has contacted them, they've refused to respond. And, my justice and accountability, let alone, we know what happened on the Tanzanian side. It was a bribe, corruption, and it is expected that Tanzania is not going to act in giving any accountability. But what about Australia, who has a justice system and have denied not just me, but many citizens who go overseas? It's sometimes likely that you'd get into trouble just for smoking weed, and there's death penalties in Malaysia and Australia, so yes. Malaysia and Indonesia, but even just things like Malaysia, they very similarly, if you were with a Malay girl, they could just put you in jail because they're like, you can't take our women away from us.
Wow.
That has happened to a couple of friends of mine who were Pakistanis, and they were dating Malay women, and they would just find a charge on them and they would just put them in for a night. And imagine if you're a foreign citizen, like if you're an Australian citizen, and they're like, oh, we're not going to let you out. And then Australia right now doesn't care about human rights, doesn't care about what we're losing. It doesn't care about what individuals are losing, but more about their not even political, more about their diplomatic ties. And I'm like, there was a point where you would Google Tanzania and my news was up there, right up there. And not only did they lose my passport, they leaked my birth, like my names, everything. And I was like, you've now made not only me insane, but also people around me as well. Everywhere I go, people would recognize me. And it's like, I stopped drinking alcohol at that time because I was so scared somebody would slip in something in my drink that I would only order like bottled water. And I'm like, just give me bottled water. Like, that's it. Like, that's how paranoid I was. Because my arrest, the way they found my brother was they were following me for 3 weeks. All of it was illegal. All of it.
It's like a movie, isn't it? Like,
it's based on me.
For somebody sitting here listening to this story, it sounds like a movie plot. Like, it does exist, and it is real. We are so sheltered from this.
Yeah. And you know, when I came, I've had people ask me, like, having been through all of this, you know, and your family as well, do you regret being an activist?
Yes.
Like, you know, it's a natural question to ask, but I don't. Like, if anything, they made the biggest mistake to give me a platform. Like, if anything, they've just gone like, oh, you introduced Zara Kay to Tanzania, and now Tanzanians, because East Africa religion is held deeply no matter what, and they're not as radicals as Pakistan would be, but knowing that my community was like this, it's bordering radicalization. Like, it is in a way.
Well, and now you're creating your own community. So I am going to tie it up there, and thank you so much for your time. I want to support, and my listeners want to support you, because it's not only bringing awareness to what happens, but bringing tools to people who have or want to undergo that change, and developing a community where it is accepted. Like you say, you know, why can't people just accept it and move on, or scroll through it if they don't agree with it, rather than jump up and down, arrest you, or whatever else? I think it's fear-based, and I think it's, you know, it comes from a challenge of belief systems, when people don't understand this is what I've believed for my entire life. You're now challenging that, whether it's religion or whatever it is. I think that's where the conflict happens. But I want to thank you for bringing those tools, for bringing that awareness to not only women in Australia, but on a global platform, that, you know, we are able to do whatever we want to do, whether it is wear the hijabi or not, you know, or, you know, practice Muslim and not wear it, or whatever it is giving that rise of awareness to our bodies, to our career. So where can our listeners find you, support you?
Yeah, so, well, the charity I run, Faithless Hijabi, is all over social media in the same, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I would be under the name Zara, Kayk. So it does sound like cake.
Hey. Make me hungry.
I like it though, because when I had it, I was like, how do I end my name? Because Zara Kay, it's taken as a username. So put a K in the end again. And it just worked out. So it would be ZARAKAYK on all of the platforms. And yes, please, just those likes and tweets and retweets do help bring people in your circle awareness about what's happening. And it's a global thing. It's people in Australia who need help as well. But if not help, just empowerment. Just empowerment in owning Muslims or not, owning your body, owning, like, you know, owning your autonomy.
Yes. Well, thank you again. That was gone from what I thought was going to be a 30-minute podcast to we could have been here all night long, because it's now turned into about an hour and a half. And I couldn't be happier to get that time from you, because it has been something that I've been passionate about, especially following your arrest. And you know, so proud that regardless of that fear factor and what you've been through, you don't give up. So thank you for every woman whose life has changed because of you.
Well, thank you, Katie. That means so much to me.
And we'll be sharing your journey, and I will on my social media platforms. And once this podcast goes live, I will add all those social handles as well.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll see you soon.
Yeah, sounds good.